Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish. We are here discussing the news and the views from the week that was. I am joined today by SNP MP Marion Fellows and Mirela Delibegović, Dean of Industrial Engagement at Aberdeen University. First, the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. yesterday, 583 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 have been registered. None of the new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, 3,215,770 people have received their first dose now of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 1,998,409 have received their second dose. At weekends, only statistics on new cases, deaths and vaccinations are updated. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 2,072,796 people in Scotland have been tested. Of these, 1,837,901 tests were confirmed negative. 234,895 tests were positive. 7,668 patients who tested positive have sadly died. So we will move on now to discussions over Dominic Cummings. And I'm going to come first to you, Marion, who I'm sure has been following this very closely. Dominic Cummings has released a lot of bombshells over the past week. And he has described a lot of his former colleagues in quite unsavoury terms and released some things that we were told by the press anyway, but have now been confirmed by Mr. Cummings. What do you think of the developments, and what does it mean for the Conservative government and for Boris Johnson's premiership? Sorry, Marion, we appear to be having some technical difficulties.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Yeah. I'll keep refreshing my video link. Thank you. I wasn't able to follow in detail on the day, but I thought my colleagues, Carol Monaghan and Anam Kaiser Javid, they were excellent. I think some of the stuff that Mr. Cummings came up with was funny in a humorous way, but really, really serious. I think it just confirmed what we actually knew about how dysfunctional this government can be. Unfortunately, it's only now, in the last I read a poll this morning, that said Boris's popularity has actually dropped for the first time in quite a long while, from +6 to -6. But it doesn't seem to be the new taste normally. It seems to be no matter what he does, that people just like him and vote for him in England, in Wales perhaps, but not in Scotland. The interesting thing for me about all of the Cummings things was what he didn't say. So he had in his sights Boris, Carrie, now his wife apparently, the dog, and Matt Hancock. But funnily enough, not a mention of Mr. Gove, which I found really interesting.
Yes, it is interesting. And watching him over the last week, I was struck by quite how confident he looked. I mean, bear in mind, this is a man who has been disgraced and whose popularity was in the gutter before he was disgraced. So what do you think that means, Mirela? I mean, he's been briefing to people that he would potentially work with another government or indeed with the Labour Party. I have never seen a man being questioned by Parliament who has looked so ebullient.
Well, obviously, I should say as a disclaimer, these are all personal opinions, and I'm not a politician, I'm a scientist. But first of all, to be quite frank with you, I wasn't even listening to what he has got to say, because I still think he has so much to answer for from last year, and checking the vision, going to the Bernard Castle, COVID positive, to be testing his vision. I think that is just absolutely disgusting. So I find it interesting that we are not discussing those issues at all. So how much we can trust what he's got to say is a dubious one. But as you just said earlier, some of these things that have been revealed are not a surprise to anyone. And I think this is something that's going to have to be discussed properly. The fact that test and trace has not worked and it's probably still not working. The fact that, we were all in lockdown, yet we were allowing thousands of passengers to come in on different flights without any quarantine, etc. Some of the things that have been said about what has been happening behind closed doors with Matt Hancock, obviously, have been incredibly interesting, and again, not surprising whatsoever. The disarray, that the unpreparedness for the pandemic. I know this is an event that nobody was expecting, and everybody would have had a difficult time to deal with. However, we do expect and rely that our government will be the one leading us through situations like this one, and it is absolutely mortifying to be learning some of these revelations. Now, I think we will need a public inquiry to see how the government actually responded to the pandemic, what was done, what could have been done better. But I think also just going forward, just to reiterate the fact that the government needs to be working much better with the scientific community and should have been working better with the scientific community from the very start. So those are just some of my personal opinions about what's going on.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The first 100 days plan for recovery has been being discussed by the Scottish Government. A key part of that appears to be a potential coalition with the Scottish Greens. I'm going to come first to you, Mirela, and ask, what do you think that means for Scotland? Do you think that we could have a very positive outcome in this coalition discussion?
So I guess I always saw that the Scottish Greens were probably working very closely with SNP before anyway, so I'm not 100% sure how much is going to change. And as I say, I'm not a politician, so I don't know, but I do like what the priorities are for the first 100 days, which is to help Scotland recover from the pandemic. And I like the emphasis on helping our National Health Service. This is where the priority should be, working with the NHS and helping the NHS not only deal with the pandemic that we are still under, but also clear the backlog of all the patients who maybe will have and should have had their appointments to check for different types of cancer, appointments that will have affected people with heart disease, diabetes, all sorts of metabolic diseases that we've had, unfortunately, no access to the services. So I like the emphasis on the NHS, as well as the new proposal for National Care Service. I think that's what it's called. Another emphasis that I do like is the work with the schools and kind of trying to get rid of that attainment gap, which is now only widened with the pandemic. As a mother of two children, I can see that there are very different circumstances that the schools have been able to deal with in regards to private schools versus state schools. So I do like that there's a lot of emphasis on improving the education in the first 100 days.
Yeah, the National Care Service and bridging the attainment gap have been things that both the SNP and the Greens seem to have been united on. Marion, can you outline for us then what you think the priorities for this SNP government will be over the next 100 days and over the next few years?
Yes, I think Mirela's actually listed quite a lot of them. The one thing that she didn't mention was the establishment of the new Council for Economic Transformation, and that will be chaired by the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney. I think the absolute priority has to be the NHS recovery plan. I mean, the NHS functioned amazingly right throughout the pandemic, and urgent treatment for cancer was carried out, but it's the backlog of normal, if you like, appointments that really needs to be worked upon. One of the other issues, the National Care Service, carers have been undervalued, and that is carers who unpaid, but carers who also work generally sometimes for local authorities and more often than not now for private companies, have been really not let down, but not as looked after or not as valued. Speaking personally, I know what a great job carers do. I had real personal experience of that through my husband. So that's really important. I think also the fact that the government's promised to publish the OECD report and to link that to transformation work in schools is absolutely fantastic. The actual continuation so that 2-year-olds in exceptional circumstances and 3 and 4-year-olds will get 1,100 at 3 hours of care is really useful in nurseries. And that is amazing because that then frees up more people to go out to work to help the economic recovery, because it's not going to be easy to move on from the pandemic. Furlough will stop. There will be quite a number of difficulties over that. And I think it's absolutely right that we try and get as many people back working as normally as can be permitted, because we still don't know. I think we always have to have one eye on the ball of COVID. It won't just be a complete break from what we're doing. For example, my own staff won't be back in the office for quite a while yet, because that's the best way for them to be treated, and that's the best way I can keep them safe.
Now that former Green MSP Alison Johnson has become the presiding officer in the Holyrood Parliament, the Greens are now down to 7, which makes it 64-64 in terms of the electoral makeup. So what incentive is there then for the SNP to offer the Greens a really good deal that the Greens would like to accept, do you think, Marion?
Well, I don't think, at the moment, the talks are just what they say, talks. It may be, if things go well. I mean, there's so many common issues, there's so much common ground, and it may be a ministerial post could be offered. I don't know. It's that kind of talk is way above my pay grade. But I think what a coalition would give is real stability. I mean, the SNP minority governments have always managed to get the budgets through every year by working with other parties. And again, we're still working with other parties. One of the first things the First Minister did was have talks with Anna Saba about, as she says, we don't have all the best ideas. Let's talk, let's work together to make sure that we have a really good recovery from the COVID outbreak. So I think there may be that. Otherwise, I think it could just be, just that there's an agreement that they will vote confidence in supply, which doesn't actually mean they'll pass the budget, but means that they can have different views on other things. I mean, there are many, many intangibles and many, many variations of what could come out of this talks. But I think if there were to be a coalition or a confidence supply agreement, it does give that a bit more stability to the Parliament. And that means that things can progress more smoothly.
Moving on then, the Tories have been trying to block devolved governments from engaging internationally with other countries. They've said, the SNP in fact have warned that this is a dangerous threat to Scotland's international standing after Tory MSP wrote to his Westminster bosses saying Scotland's efforts to cooperate with other nations are wasteful. What do you have to say about that, Marion Fellows and Mirela Delibegović? So we'll go to you first, Marion.
Yeah, we've known since the Internal Market Bill what the Tory government's views are about Scotland and about other devolved countries. They're not interested. They want all the money that used to come into devolved nations through their governments for them to spend as best suited their targets, what their people wanted. That's all, that's all gone. Boris Johnson wants to, and Alistair Jack includes, want to blazon everything in Scotland with a union flag and to say you're only getting this because you're part of the union. Now, that's no way to deal with devolution. These are issues that are really come to the heart of what's happening. And if you think back to Brexit, all the things that Scottish fishermen were promised, all the things that the farmers and so on have been promised, it's not looking as good now from their point of view after Brexit as it was when they were being promised sun, moon and stars. And if everything tends to be still is held at London level in the UK government, then it's not going to be as useful or as good for farming and fishing and food production in Scotland as it would be when it's actually devolved properly and done by people who are closer to where the action is. And that's really the main thrust and should be the main thrust of devolution.
Mirela, do you think that this is something that a coalition with the Greens could help in terms of international standing to show that the independence debate isn't just about one party?
Well, I think in general, so I was only aware of this, kind of reading up on this weekend, and I always say that, first of all, the micromanagement never works, and if you try and micromanage people, you're only going to have the opposite effect. I mean, Scotland has always had an amazing reputation internationally. So if we think about our arts and humanities, if we think about our sciences, we are world known for all these things, and as a devolved nation, it is expected that we would be building relationships across the world. So I know the priorities are to be working closer with the USA, Canada, China, India, etc. All of our European partners, we must remember that Scotland was majority anti-Brexit, and we are all very international in our thinking and international and global in the way we work and operate. So I think our priorities should stay to keep working with all of our European neighbours, as well as all the global partners, and just keep working away. In regards to whether the coalition is going to look stronger, I think Scotland in general is strong and has always been seen as a very strong country for all the inventions that we have had. I mean, I'll use one example. This year is 100 years since the discovery of insulin. We mustn't forget that the J.J.R. MacLeod, who got one of the people who got the Nobel Prize for discovery of insulin, is a born Aberdonian, went to University of Aberdeen Grammar School. And actually, as Scotland, we are organising a Pan-Scotland event to celebrate all the contributions that Scottish scientists have made in this journey, as well as what Scottish science is doing at the moment and in future. So it's just the way it is. And as I say, this kind of blip and trying to request that we must get an approval for our international relationships is not going to work, because we are international, and I think this is how we're going to keep working away.
Yeah, Marion, going back then just slightly to that coalition discussion, the red lines for the Green Party, we're not sure what they will be yet, but they may be likely to be, for instance, Gender Recognition Act reform, reforming the council tax, universal basic income, etc. Do you think the SNP are willing to move on any of those? And do you think, what do you think that the SNP's red lines would be to go into some form of arrangement?
I think, as I said earlier, the talks are talks. I think everything is up for discussion. The Greens' red lines are not entirely clear at the moment. And although it's a good idea, what the ones you've mentioned are probably, high on their list of priorities, but just because they're talks doesn't mean that that's exactly what would happen. For the SNP, I think everyone would know that the red line would be, and there's not going to be a red line on an independence referendum
Yeah.
and a bill to support that. So I think there's lots of room for talks and for flexibility on both sides. Where they're at and what everyone that's been talking about this publicly, John Swinney, Lorna Slater, have been, I don't know if cagey is the right word, have been guarded in what they're saying, because talking too much about things you don't actually know about and you don't actually know what is happening can be dangerous. But I think there's probably good grounds for a lot of cooperation. I mean, this wouldn't be Scotland's first government like this. I mean, the very first devolved administration, as they called themselves, was Labour and the Lib Dems. I don't think, but the Greens have got more to gain than the SNP have to lose in these talks, I think, because we have got far more MPs. It's not even as I don't know, as balanced as the Labour Lib Dem coalition was in 1999.
Yeah,
So
the
we'll
big
have to wait and
elephant
see, I
in the
think.
room there, I think, would be the oil industry. Mirela, what do you think both parties are likely to say and do in terms of a just transition away from the oil industry and towards full renewables? Do you think that's possible within the next few years of this Parliament?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, we are the leaders in kind of pushing towards net zero solutions and, renewables in general. So I think this is definitely a scope for Scotland to lead the way again in green energy. So absolutely, I mean, we're known UK-wide that we are the ones pushing for net zero solutions. So this is a massive opportunity for us. And there's funding going into these, and there's definitely willingness and a real motion towards moving in the right direction. So I think this is a huge opportunity which is going to be successful for us. So absolutely, I would agree.
Yeah, so going back then to the Tories trying to stop international engagement with Scotland. There's a statement that's been released by the SNP's, I think, Sterling Evelyn, saying this is nothing more than a ham-fisted attempt to put Scotland in its place. The Tories have nothing positive to offer Scotland, and that is why they are continually rejected in election after election. A lot of the work that's going on here in other nations is happening in the British embassies. Do you think that in some way hampers us in any way, Marion? Sorry, Marion, I can't hear you just now. We appear to have lost Marion temporarily, so... Oh, there, you're back.
Yeah, in fact, thank you. The Tories can't have it always. It was Ian Lang, I think, when he was Secretary of State, opened an outreach, if you like, in Brussels. And I can't even remember, it's so long ago how that happened. British embassies are at the moment, we are part of Britain, so we're entitled to our share of the embassies. There's been a Scotland office for business and so on in London for long enough. There have been these offices promoting Scotland have been working well for a number of years, number of decades, and now they seem to think that it's something terrible. I think they're really worried this time. I think the Tory government is really worried that Boris Johnson might be the PM who loses Scotland, and they're going to throw everything at it to try and stop that happening. And I think a lot of what they're doing is backfiring on itself, because people see through what they're trying to do and think, well, this has been going on forever. Why just try and stop it now? Scotland should be promoted as a separate part at the moment of the United Kingdom and Great Britain, and part of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But Scotland has always been a nation state that looked outward look towards Europe in the first instance. You've got, going back centuries, Kouros, for example, in Fife, looked right across the North Sea to the Low Countries, and we were first in Poland and towards Russia. We've always looked outwards, we've always looked abroad. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, and I think it probably is going to backfire on the Tories if they try and put a halt to that.
What can Scotland do then, both officially and unofficially, in order to set out its distinct vision in the world, do you think, Mirela, now that we are being told, essentially, to be quiet about it?
I mean, that's a very big question for me. Being a scientist, probably not the most appropriate one, but as I say, Scotland is already globally recognized as a country where all the inventions have been coming through for centuries, not just the last decades. So I think we already have that recognition worldwide. But just as it was said earlier, I mean, we have always been reaching out to our European partners, and I think we should continue to do that. When I just think about sciences, the exchange of science between all of our European partners through Horizon 2020 before funding has been absolutely amazing. And the amount of funding that UK in general has been getting through Horizon 2020 has been disproportionately higher than what we were putting in. Just shows how important it is what we are doing here, and I think we just need to keep pushing forward. I mean, I remember when I used to work in the States that I was invited to quite a few Scotland International Office events, and people knew about Scotland and they knew about all the great work that happens, and I think we just need to keep promoting that, and we need to keep pushing for international relationships, not losing any of those and actually gaining more.
Yeah.
So, moving on then from there, research has shown that minimum pricing has been successful in reducing alcohol consumption over the past few years. Marion, do you think this is a success of the Scottish Government?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it was a hard-fought fight to be allowed to do it in the first place. But I think what's now coming forward, the evidence coming forward now, just absolutely says that was the right thing to do. I think it was never right that it was cheaper to buy cans of high alcoholic content of beer or cider or whatever, and it was cheaper to buy that than it was to buy bottles of water. That was crazy. That was just ridiculous. And I think the fact that it is high, it's the cheap, nasty booze, if you want to put it like that, that has suffered. And all the scare stories about how it would, people would stop drinking altogether, it's not happened. I'm not saying it should happen, but the high-end market, the whisky folk who were saying, no, we can't possibly do this, they've not been affected by this, but what we have is starting to be a much healthier population drink-wise, because it's impossible now to buy the really cheap, nasty stuff.
Yeah, a lot of the beverages that have been affected have been those which are primarily consumed by younger people. Do you think also lockdown has played a part in this? So, of course, young people have not been meeting, certainly in the same numbers that they were prior to lockdown. So do you think that this could also be playing into it, Mirela?
So, first of all, I would like to say that this is showing that this has been a huge success, and it exactly took so many years to pass this through, and all eyes have been on Scotland. We are the first in the world to do this, and I think we should be applauded for the success so far. So you're absolutely right. We started in 2018, but this is actually a second report. There had been a report before the lockdown to show that there was I think 8% decrease in alcohol sales. So it had been suggested it was working already. So it was kind of 1 year on. Now it's kind of, new data showing that, again, we are maintaining that 8% less sales. And what's really interesting and important to point out is those who were the households that were high consumption. So it is our teenagers, etc. Now, it's an interesting question you have asked, whether the lockdown will have affected this. I would have actually thought that the lockdown would have, if anything, would have affected it the other way around. We know there is kind of anecdotal evidence that people have been drinking a lot more from the first lockdown to the second one. There were a lot of people who were on furlough. We know that there's an increase in depression, and all of these things, all these factors are associated with increased alcohol consumption. So I actually think it is quite astounding that despite all these factors, that we have seen this kind of consistent 8% decrease in alcohol purchases. And it's now nice to see that the similar kind of data coming out of Wales as well, who introduced it on 2nd of March, I think just before the first lockdown. So whether it affects how much the teenagers have been able to access the shops, possibly, but I think the teenagers necessarily were not necessarily the target audience. It is those who would be more likely to be able to access the shops, kind of 18 to 21-year-olds. And one would have thought that the alcohol consumption would have gone up during that period. I think what will be quite interesting now to know, we should be soon starting to get some data on liver-associated diseases. So hospitalizations due to alcohol consumption, so liver cirrhosis. Unfortunately, as a UK, actually, we're world known for our alcoholic steatohepatitis. I have known colleagues who've moved from Canada to do research in UK because there weren't enough examples over there of people who were over-consuming alcohol. So I think what would be really good to know is now to get Scottish data and then followed by Welsh data, whether we actually have less other comorbidities that would have come with overconsumption of alcohol. And it is really interesting to see that now parents in England are pushing towards introduction of minimal unit price. I think it's a positive step forward, and it's another example of our ability to actually kind of deliver public policy changes that will improve the health of the nation.
Yeah. Marion Fellows, then, Scotland's alcohol abuse problem seems to be lessening, but its problem with illegal drugs does not seem to be particularly. Why do you think that is, and what can be done about it? Sorry, Marion, we seem to have some technical difficulties again. There we go.
Yeah, I've refreshed the browser. It seems to work. I think it's a hangover from the Thatcher years, and when there was a big increase in drugs consumption and drugs became cheap and they became a way of life for lots of people, and we still have that legacy. I think it's really important now. The First Minister admitted that the Scottish Government had taken its eye off the ball on drug use. But I think if you look at some of the work that's been done worldwide and some of the work done by the Scottish Affairs Committee at the House of Commons, where they went to Canada and Portugal and looked at drug consumption rooms to try and see if it would cut down on the number of drug deaths. And, their conclusion was it would, but that's not something the Scottish Government can do on its own. It requires UK government to allow us to do it, if I can put it like that. I think the appointment of Angela Constance to look at drugs consumption and look at ways of helping people come off drugs and ways of treatment for that, I think that's a really good step forward. And I mean, Angela's background is in work like that before she became an MSP, so it's someone who knows, if you like, what they're doing in that area. I think all of this has to be looked at as a piece, and it's really frustrating and something not to have control over everything that affects the use of drugs and the help people need to stop using them. And that's really, really, really frustrating for the Scottish Government and for anyone involved in drug work trying to help folk. It just seems to be we have to hope that something like what's happening with alcohol use may actually help turn out to be something useful to apply as well to the use of drugs. Now, I'm not saying there's any great synergy across it, but I think the fact that the Scottish Government look at something, see the problem and try to move it forward is really useful and helpful. And if they can use some of those strategies, I think that would be a big help forward.
Do you think legalisation of certain drugs might be an option for the SNP in the future then, Marion?
Well, I know it's always being looked at, and I know a number of my colleagues, Ronnie Cowan, for example, wants to look at legalisation of, well, not necessarily for the full gamut, but cannabis use for people who are ill and who require it. And the new laws aren't working as well as they should. So there is room, I think, and time for people to have a look at this again. I mean, when we talk about cannabis, when I was a young person, I mean, the strength of cannabis that one could achieve or reach, that was available on the streets, wasn't nearly as powerful as the cannabis now. And these sort of factors have to be taken into consideration as well. So it's not just a simple matter of legalising. I think it's a matter of looking at where the drugs are coming from. And so that County Lines operation this week was quite useful in actually getting dealers off the street and getting children who'd been involved in running drugs into a better environment.
Moving to the story from Canada now. Remains of 215 children have been found at former Indigenous school site in Canada. The remains of 215 children, some as young as 3 years old, were found at the site of a former residential school for Indigenous children. A discovery Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has described as heartbreaking on Friday. What do we say about this? I mean, Mirela, what are your initial thoughts about what happened here?
I mean, what can we say? I think this is just absolutely horrible. And, not that I'm saying it's more horrible for those of us who are parents, but it's just when you read stories like this, it's just heartbreaking. So this new discovery of 215 children apparently is actually building on previous numbers, which were 4,100 children who had died in this school, from what I understand, or going through this school. It just shows all the kind of inequalities from earlier on in the centuries before, and how we have dealt with people. And actually, it's something that we're going to be touching upon later in our discussions, how we deal with people in general and how we give people dignity in the treatment. I think it's just absolutely appalling. Obviously there's going to be an investigation, etc. But I think we need to learn from this and really learn. I mean, we constantly say we're going to learn and this is not going to happen again. But unfortunately, I'm not really sure that we have learned so much over the past decades. So I just found it absolutely awful. And, obviously Canadian government is going to be dealing with this and apologising for the things that have happened in the past. But it's just heartbreaking.
Canada's residential school system forcibly separated Indigenous children from their families. This has been described as cultural genocide. The report documented horrific physical abuse, rape, malnutrition and other atrocities suffered by many of the 150,000 children who attended the schools, typically run by Christian churches on behalf of Ottawa from the 1840s to the 1990s. Marion, what are your thoughts on it? I don't want to ask anything specific because what can you say, but what are your thoughts on how Canada deals with this?
I mean, I think there's always an issue when you're dealing with historical cases, and this is not as historic if it was going up to the 1990s as it might have been. I think the way the British Empire treated folk who were there first across the world was awful. I think we're now recognising that with Black History, Month and
Yeah.
all sorts of things like that. And the fact that these were Indigenous children, I think, is appalling. But the way that we treated, society treated children quite up till quite recently was also quite appalling. And now that we've got the new UN rights for the child, which thank goodness the Scottish Government has put into legislation here, although it is being fought. It will be fought in the future in the courts because the UK government are not happy that the Scottish Government have done that. But there has been a cultural shift in how we treat children generally. But like most things, it doesn't come quickly enough. I think it's for children, and I keep going on about my advanced years, but when I was a child, children didn't have rights. You sat in the corner, you did what you were told, and you were not considered worthy of attention in a general sense by lawmakers, by people who ran children's homes, by anything like that. But this whole thing of 215 recent discoveries is just appallingly awful, and I don't think anyone would say anything that could justify that. And I think when you're looking at historical things like this, you have to vow that this is gone and it will never come back, and that children do have rights and they have to be observed and looked at and fought for, just the same as human rights for adults are. And I think that's the most important thing we can take forward from this.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that you point out that this is the legacy of empire as much as anything else. Mirela, do you think that plays into this?
Well, obviously it does. It's just the way that people were treated in the past. As I said, this is not just a matter of the past and the empire. We're seeing now in the news all the time families being separated from their children. People crossing borders in the USA and children being separated from their parents. This is something we really need to learn from. And Marion is absolutely right. This is not that long ago. And I do worry nowadays that we haven't still moved on from things. With all the things that are going around the world. So it is appalling, but we need to actually do something about it. And you're absolutely right, children in the past didn't have a right to a voice, but there are still places around the world at the moment where children don't have a right to a voice, and that needs to be changed.
Yeah. So let's talk then about the EU settlement scheme. The hostile environment that has been created by Conservative governments and perhaps previous governments towards EU migrants has resulted now in people being deported again in dawn raids, etc. What do you think about this, Marion Fellows, and what do you think about the actions in Glasgow of the people there to stop some of this from happening?
I mean, I have to say, my heart lifted when I saw folk actually out fighting this. It's very difficult sometimes when I look at Priti Patel, as I sometimes have to do across the chamber. And she came to this country as an immigrant, parents came as migrants, fleeing persecution. And the othering of people is something that actually plays to the lowest common denominator in people. Theresa May started it with her vans touring the country, telling folk to go home. But to actually take people who have been living and contributing here for a long number of years, and the system for immigration and for asylum seekers, and they're two different things, I do know that, but the system, the Home Office systems for knowing who's come in, knowing who's entitled to stay, the length of time they take to sort out court cases, the fact that they just now want to ship people out without respecting their human rights is actually appalling. I thought that the citizens of Glasgow did a great job in defying these dawn raids. There are ways of treating people. which are much more progressive and are much better. For example, the kind of conditions that asylum seekers have been living in Glasgow, in those hotels, is just appalling. And no matter how much my colleagues in Glasgow have fought and talked to the Home Office about this, nothing seems to have been done about that either. And this is a further example of that. It's the whole attitude of othering people and using scapegoats when systems are not working properly, and when Scotland needs people and England doesn't, to actually not allow to allow immigration to be devolved to Scotland is perverse, absolutely perverse.
Do you think the government and the Home Office perhaps thought that they could do this a little bit under the radar while people were distracted with COVID and the elections and everything that's been going on over the past few months and the past year? Do you think that's perhaps played a part in why they've decided to move forward with this so aggressively, Mirela?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to talking about dignity, giving people dignity, that, you know, we're all equal. I've given a number of school talks where, you know, I talk about my experiences of coming from war-torn Bosnia to living and being part of Scotland. And I always tell school-age children, nobody goes and risks their life, you know, just for the sake of it. People don't go on a rubber dinghy across the sea without being able to swim, without a really good legitimate reason, okay? And we need to give people dignity. I thought it was absolutely appalling what was happening, especially considering that those arrests were being made on Eid, the holiest of Islamic festivals. It was just after Ramadan, and I thought that was completely disrespectful, even if we just don't think about anything else. As I say, obviously, I have a bit of a conflict of interest being an immigrant to the country myself. But, you know, I have been there myself, submitting paperwork to the Home Office every single year to renew my student visas. And I always felt like a criminal. I had to prove that I am not a criminal. And it's just, you know, kind of complete inability to treat people with dignity. And absolutely, as you say, we need people in Scotland to work and contribute to the economy. And these are people who come here who actually want to work and contribute to the economy. They want to integrate, they want to be part of our society. So treating them in the way that they have been treated is absolutely disgusting.
Just 14 asylum seekers were pressed on board a flight, Esperato 11, that left from Stansted on the 12th of August last year, bound for Toulouse and Frankfurt. There are reports of people who have self-harmed. There are people who have been treated horrendously by those who were restraining them to get them onto this flight. What can Scotland do about it, Marion Fellows? I mean, is there anything that we can do? Because as you say, immigration is currently not devolved. Marion.
Right, I can't think. All right, thank you. No, there's, because all of this immigration is a reserved matter, we can demonstrate, the First Minister can write, government ministers can write to the Home Office, MPs can write to the Home Office, but at the end of the day, our hands are tied. And what we actually need is a cultural change, and in England, at the Home Office, and you know, the situation is so different in Scotland. We get looked at very strangely in the Chamber of the House of Commons when we stand up and speak up for immigrants and asylum seekers, and say that we're happy to take people because we need them. It's something that just has not permeated beyond Scotland. The fact that we welcome refugees, we welcome asylum seekers, we welcome economic migrants who want to actually contribute. Scotland has always been a country that went out, Scottish people went out all over the world and did exactly the same thing. So we don't, in the main, in the majority of people don't mind other people doing the same here, especially in times like this where we need the force. And even, I think the thing that's really quite telling is all the NHS workers in England, NHS England, who were from different countries, got praise upon praise heaped upon them. But the minute COVID is over, many of them will be subject to the same sort of stuff that those chaps in 10 Muir Street were. They're not supposed to be here, so off you go, and we'll make you, and we will treat you as we like because you shouldn't be here, and it's our job to get rid of you and put you on planes against your will and to treat you badly in the process. I don't know. Independence is the only answer as far as I'm concerned, and for immigration, unless we can get Boris Johnson's government to agree to devolve stuff, and that's looking increasingly unlikely.
Well, I'm going to move to Mirela now and ask about something which happened 26 years ago now, which is the massacre in Kapija. You are from Bosnia yourself originally, is that correct? And I don't know if you have any personal memories of what happened then, or if it's something that has affected you directly.
Yeah, so this year was 26 years since the Kapija massacre. So I am originally from Tuzla in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Tuzla during the Bosnian War was the biggest safe haven for all the refugees that have escaped from different places, including Srebrenica, Banja Luka, Prijedor, Visegrad, all the places where the Serbian army committed genocide. So it was a hot summer's day. So I should say at this point in time, I was in Scotland for just under a year, and my 18th birthday was going to be on the 26th of May, so the day after. And I called my parents on my 18th birthday because they couldn't call me, only to find out what had happened the night before. So about 9 o'clock in the evening, after about 2 months of ceasefire and no shelling or whatever, young people of Bosnia had gone outside, walking around. So, this Kapija is in the city center. Kapija means the gate. So it's the city center of Tuzla, with all the cafes and bistros being full with lots of young people and families. When the shell landed from one of the mountains from so-called Republika Srpska, and 2 shells landed in the city center and murdered 71 people and injured 240 people. I personally knew and had friends who died that day, and I personally have friends who were wounded. One of my next door neighbors, who was a footballer, he was the same age as me, so he would have been just 18. He lost his leg and he was sent to Norway for reconstructive surgery. Another next door neighbor, she had her spine damaged as well as her legs. These are all children, 18. So the average age was 18 to 24. The youngest person was 2 years of age, and there was one over 70. Everybody else was a teenager or a young person. I always find it so moving every year when I go back home to go to the graveyard. They actually buried most of them together. So out of 71 that died that night, 51 were buried together. In the most beautiful spot in Tuzla, and every time I go, I give a prayer to all of them, and just hope that they've gone on somewhere nicer. But one of the things that really hurt everyone and hurt the families, that nobody is in prison for that yet. So many people died, so many people injured, so many families' lives changed forever, yet we have nobody in prison at the moment. The guy who had been sentenced and was found guilty is, my understanding, still hiding in Serbia and hasn't been extradited. So every year, while I do celebrate my birthday, it's a really mixed feeling. And as I always say, we mustn't forget that all these atrocities that happened years ago just keep repeating themselves. Every single time we think never again, we find it again. So after that, of course, we know that Srebrenica genocide happened as well. So yeah, it's a very emotional time for all the Bosnians to think about.
Yeah.
Yes,
The
that is
massacre
correct. It was
happened on the Day of
Day of
Youth, didn't it? And
Yes, it was the Day of Youth. 25th of May was actually General Tito's birthday. So on 25th of May, we would always have parades. And this is how I grew up. I remember we would go to the parades and everybody would be celebrating. And actually, the reason so many young people were out that night as well is because it was the Day of Youth. Thank you for actually reminding me of that. 25th of May was always a celebration day for us, and this is exactly why we were targeted. And massive massacre.
as Mirela points out, this was targeted at civilians. There was no military involvement here other than the military attacking civilian people in the area. It's hard not to see parallels between that and some of the things that have been going on recently in Israel and Palestine. Is that not correct, Marion?
Well, where there are divisions, and it's just appalling what happened. It's appalling what's happening in Israel and in Gaza and the West Bank, all of that. We look at the Uyghurs, it seems as though mankind, and I use humankind, has an absolute ability to do the most awful things to people that they see as different or other from them, separate from them. And I sometimes despair. If I think about every year in Parliament we talk about Srebrenica. We've had lots of debates on the Uyghurs. We've had lots of debates on different horrible international incidents. And every year we have the Holocaust Memorial Day, which does more than, and the Holocaust Memorial Trust does more than just remember the Holocaust. It also works with young people, because this is the future. If we can get young people to understand that young people of a different culture, even if they're in the same country, are just the same as them. And that's where I think we have to focus our attention and our work, to make sure that young people understand that the folk that have been othered are just the same as them. Same hopes, same dreams, same ambition, and same right to life. And I just do not know how we move this forward, other than trying to make a cultural change across the world.
The UN, of course, stepped in 1995. A question finally that I'll put to both of you then is, what is the role of the UN in the current conflict in the Gaza Strip, Mirela?
Oh gosh, you're asking me a lot, as I always say. Unfortunately, they stepped in after genocide was actually done over Bosnian Muslims, and Srebrenica happened. When I watch what's been happening in Gaza Strip, I just can't stop crying, to be honest. I see it again, children being murdered, civilians being killed, and nothing is done. Something needs to change, and we need to have proper peace talks and a proper negotiation of how the two-state agreement works. We've been talking about it for how many decades? This cannot continue. Are we just going to keep watching it every couple of years and say this is worse than 2 years ago? There needs to be a solution, and it is the responsibility of UN and all the nations to come together and help Israel and Palestine get out of this properly.
Marion, would you echo those sentiments at all?
I would absolutely echo those sentiments. It seems unbelievable almost that the latest atrocities on both sides are just happening over and over again. It needs to stop. There needs to be a two-state solution. There has to be respect on both sides, and politics has to be kept out of this. It cannot go on like this anymore. It really, really can't.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Marion Fellows and Mirela Delibegović. I am Scott Bevan, and thank you for joining us today on the Full Scottish at Broadcasting Scotland.
Thank you.
Thank you.